Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sports all around the world. My name is Younes Filali, and for this 8th episode, we take a step back. Over the past 2 episodes, we heard 2 powerful perspectives on athletes and governance. In episode 6, featuring IOC young leader Sung-Hyun Lee, we explored the Olympic movement from within, athlete commissions, institutional reform, growing gender representation, and the idea that global sport is gradually becoming more athlete-centered. In episode 7, with Olympian Nikki Dryden, we shifted to moments of crisis. Athletes withdrawing from competitions, facing retaliation, legal uncertainty, and relying on NGOs when institutions fail to protect them. Both conversations were compelling, both were credible, and yet they reveal a deeper tension. What does athlete-centered governance actually mean? Is it about giving athletes a voice inside decision-making structures? Or is it about guaranteeing protection when that voice carries risk? Today's episode is not about choosing sides. It is about examining the gap between representation and protection, and asking whether global sport performs equally well in both. Because perhaps the real test of athlete-centered governance is not how it works in stable environments, but how it responds when athletes challenge the system itself. Let's break it down. When institutions describe themselves as athlete-centered, they often point first to representation. And to be fair, this is not insignificant. Across the Olympic movement and many international federations, athletes today have more formal access to governance structures than they did 2 decades ago. There are athletes' commissions at almost every level. There are consultation forums. There are structured surveys. And in some cases, there are also voting rights. This signals an important shift, because sports governance was built with a certain hierarchy. Federations governed, athletes performed, decision-making authority sat at the top, and communication flowed downward. The introduction of athlete commissions disrupted that model, at least symbolically. The idea is clear. If athletes are the core stakeholders of sports, their voices should shape policy, competition formats, welfare standards, and even strategic direction. From this perspective, athlete-centered governance means institutionalized participation, structured dialogue, increased diversity, greater gender representation, mechanisms to transmit athlete concerns into board-level discussions, and in stable contexts where there is no immediate conflict, this model can function relatively well. For example, educational initiatives are shaped by athlete feedback, gender representation metrics improve, development pathways are adjusted, safeguarding reforms expand. These are not cosmetic reforms, they are tangible. So, analytically, we must acknowledge that representation is a form of power. Even advisory power can influence long-term direction. Even consultative power can shift priorities. And in large institutions, incremental reform is often how change happens. However, representation has structural limits. First, representation is usually indirect. Athletes do not govern the system, they advise it. Final authority often remains with executive boards. Second, representation depends on institutional willingness. Voice only matters if decision makers choose to act on it. Third, representation is typically strongest in routine governance matters. education, participation, legacy, inclusion metrics. But governance is most tested not during routine operations, it is tested during crisis. And this is where we begin to see the distinction. Representation works well when athletes' interest aligns with institutional stability. But what happens when athletes' interests conflict with political realities? What happens when athlete expression creates reputational risk? What happens when neutrality becomes contested? Representation gives athletes access, but does it give them leverage? Representation gives athletes a channel, but does it guarantee protection? This is where we need to transition from voice to vulnerability. If representation is about being heard inside the system, protection is about being safe when challenging it. And the difference between those two becomes visible precisely when athletes step outside expected boundaries. If representation is about participation inside the system, protection is about what happens when the system is challenged. Episode 7 shifted the lens entirely. Instead of asking whether athletes are heard, it asked a more uncomfortable question. What happens when athletes withdraw? What happens when they speak out? What happens when their moral position conflicts with institutional priorities? In these moments, the issue is no longer representation. It is risk. Athletes who withdraw during political crisis may lose funding. They may face contractual consequences. They may be labeled as problem athletes. They may be excluded from future selection. And they may face reputational attacks or worse. This reveals a structural asymmetry in sports governance. Athletes are often bound by detailed participation agreements, and these agreements typically include clauses around conduct, disrepute, and compliance. But they rarely include enforceable non-retaliation guarantees. In other words, institutions protect themselves contractually. Athletes rarely have symmetrical safeguards. And this is where NGOs and independent actors often enter the picture. When formal governance structures don't provide rapid legal advice, independent funding, relocation pathways, or confidential reporting mechanisms, external networks step in. But that raises a deeper governance issue. If athlete-centered governance depends on external rescue mechanisms, can it truly be considered athlete-centered? Protection requires more than voice. It requires independent complaint mechanisms, clear non-retaliation frameworks, transparent due process, emergency funding structures, cross-borders legal coordination. These are not symbolic reforms, they are structural safeguards. And this is where neutrality becomes complicated. Institutions often defend neutrality as a way to avoid politicization, but neutrality in practice can function as a constraint. If an athlete expresses a position linked to human rights or armed conflict, neutrality may restrict speech rather than protect the speaker. This creates a governance dilemma. Sport claims to be separate from politics, but athletes don't live outside political realities. So the question becomes, can a system built on autonomy and neutrality effectively protect athletes during moments of political crisis? Or does autonomy primarily shield the institution from external interference? Protection is not tested in times of celebration. It is tested in moments of instability. And here is where the contrast with representation becomes sharpest. Representation assumes cooperation. Protection anticipates conflict. Representation assumes alignment, and protection prepares for rupture. If athlete-centered governance functions well when athletes collaborate with institutions, but weakens when athletes challenge them, then the model is incomplete. That doesn't mean reform is meaningless. It means reform may be conditional, and conditional empowerment isn't the same as structural protection. If representation asks who participates and protection asks who is safe, autonomy asks who ultimately controls the system. In episode 6, autonomy appears as a principle that protects sports from political interference. The Olympic movement frames itself as independent, neutral, and operating within its own governance logic. Autonomy is historically tied to the idea that sports shouldn't be captured by state politics. However, Episode 7 exposes a tension. Autonomy can function in two ways: as protection from governments or as insulation from accountability. When institutions claim they cannot intervene in national crises because of autonomy, the question becomes, is autonomy protecting athletes or protecting institutional discretion? The accountability gap appears when there is no independent review of retaliation, no transparent threshold for speech restrictions, no enforceable human rights oversight mechanism. Autonomy without external accountability risks reinforcing hierarchy, but accountability without autonomy risks political capture. So the dilemma isn't autonomy itself, it's how autonomy is structured and limited. Underneath these debates lies a deeper philosophical difference. Episode 6 reflects a reform logic. Reform logic assumes institutions can evolve. Inclusion gradually shifts power. Progress is incremental. Internal mechanisms are the vehicle for change. Episode 7 reflects a rights logic. Rights logic assumes that power doesn't voluntarily redistribute itself. Safeguards must be independent. Legal enforceability matters more than consultation. Protection must exist before crisis occurs. Reform logic prioritizes dialogue. Rights logic prioritizes enforceability. Neither is inherently wrong, but they operate on different assumptions about power. Reform asks, how do we improve the system? Rights ask, what happens when the system fails? That distinction is crucial. Perhaps the clearest difference between these two perspectives is contextual. In stable governance environments, athletes' commissions function. Educational reforms expand. Gender representation improves. Partnerships develop. In crisis environments, funding becomes leverage. Neutrality becomes contested. Contracts become tools of discipline. NGOs become first responders. So the analytical question becomes, does athlete-centered governance perform equally well in both contexts? Or is it structurally stronger in stability than in disruption? If empowerment disappears under pressure, then governance strength may be situational rather than structural. If we place these four dimensions side by side, representation and protection, autonomy and accountability, reform logic and rights logic, stability and crisis performance, a clearer theoretical contrast emerges. The two perspectives we heard can be understood through two different governance lenses. The first is a reformist institutional perspective. This view, consistent with strands of new institutionalism in political theory by March and Olson, assumes that institutions are capable of gradual evolution. Governance improves through incremental reform, adding commissions, improving diversity, strengthening consultations, refining policy. Change is embedded within the system. From this perspective, athlete-centered governance means institutional adaptation. Institutions recognize athletes as stakeholders and progressively incorporate their voice into formal structures. This model doesn't assume perfection. It assumes trajectory. The second perspective reflects what we might call a critical structural view of governance. Here, the focus shifts from inclusion to power asymmetry. Drawing on broader critical governance scholarship, including Luke's work on institutional power And Pilkes Jr.'s accountability deficits in international sports. This view asks not whether athletes are consulted, but whether they are protected when their interests conflict with institutional authority. The critical lens assumes that power rarely redistributes itself voluntarily. Therefore, protection requires enforceable safeguards, independent oversights, and constraints on institutional discretion. Under this view, governance isn't measured by how inclusive it appears in routine contexts, but how it behaves under stress. When we overlay these theoretical orientations onto the two visions, asymmetry becomes clearer. The reformist institutional perspective highlights real progress, formalized athlete commissions, growing gender representation, expanded safeguarding discourse, institutional partnerships. These are signs of institutional learning, but the critical structural perspective asks a different question. What happens when institutional stability is threatened? When athletes withdraw, when they speak out, when neutrality becomes contested, when contractual clauses collide with conscience. In those moments, representation alone isn't sufficient. This is where governance design becomes decisive. Reformist institutionalism assumes institutions evolve through dialogue. Critical structural analysis assumes institutions must be constrained through enforceable rights. Reform logic asks institutions to improve themselves. Rights logic asks institutions to bind themselves. And these are not mutually exclusive approaches, but they operate under different assumptions about power. The tension between them isn't unique to sports. It appears in international organizations, corporate governance, and political systems more broadly. But in sports, it becomes particularly visible because athletes occupy a paradoxical position. They are celebrated as the central figures of the system, yet structurally they often remain contractually subordinate to it. So perhaps the deeper insight from this discussion is that athlete-centered governance currently reflects stronger reformist institutional developments rather than structural rights entrenchment. The system is increasingly capable of managing participation. It's less consistently equipped to manage rupture. That doesn't negate progress, but it suggests that empowerment may still be conditional on alignments, and conditional empowerment is inherently fragile. If athlete-centered governance is to mature, it may need to integrate both approaches. The internal reform mechanisms that allow voice and representation, and externalized safeguards that protect athletes when disagreements emerge. The ultimate governance test isn't consultation during stability. It's protection during dissent. That's where institutional optimism meets structural reality. And that's where the future of athlete-centered governance will likely be determined. What these two conversations ultimately reveal isn't a contradiction, but a governance crossroads. Global sports has undeniably moved toward greater athlete inclusion. Representation mechanisms exist, dialogue structures are expanding, institutional reform is real, but inclusion and protection aren't identical. An athlete may have a voice in stable times and still lack safeguards in moments of crisis. So the question is no longer whether sport is becoming athlete-centered. The deeper question is, what kind of athlete-centered governance is being built? One that manages participation, or one that guarantees protection when institutional comfort is disrupted? Reformist institutional change has strengthened representation. Critical structural analysis reminds us that power must also be constrained. If global sports is to mature as a governance system, it will need both. Because the real test of athlete-centered governance isn't how well it functions when interests align. It is how it responds when they don't. And that tension between voice and vulnerability, autonomy and accountability will continue to shape the future of sports governance. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. Make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms of LinkedIn if you found this useful. You were listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Younes Filali. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.